Welcome to the Leading Movement Health Series. I'm your host, Phil Wagner, founder and CEO of Sparta Science. Today, I'm very excited to welcome SEAC Ramón Colón-López, advisor to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. SEAC Colón-López is a principal military advisor for total force integration and utilization. He also has a background as a pararescueman. Pararescuemen, often called PJs, are involved in personnel recovery and combat search and rescue. Most folks don't know it's one of the longest special operations training regimens and has a very high attrition rate. It's a very challenging process to go through, and so he has both the gravitas of being an operator as well as a leader across joint forces. Leadership often has many roles and responsibilities that are ill-defined. Some simplified and say your job is to unblock your team. And this certainly applies to SEAC Colón-López because that SEAC role is unique in the military and that the exact duties really depend on the situation. And it also spans across different branches. So once a problem is identified, SEAC Colón-López in this role works with services for a solution with the goal of possibly integrating a solution into all the services and not just one branch. So I'm very excited to welcome SEAC Colón-López to the podcast today, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here today.
Absolutely. And you're very passionate personally as well as from a leadership perspective around health. Why is it so important to organizations?
Well, there are many factors that play into the importance of health in beings. The first being availability, for them to be able to do what the CEO of the company hired them to do. The second one is their endurance. How well can they withstand some of the stresses that come along with that particular employment? The third one, and probably the most important for the private industry, is cost. If there's a life insurance type, package that comes along with employment, how much is this person costing us, and how much can it be prevented by changing some habits? And then the last part of it is morale. When somebody is absent for duty, it is very likely that somebody else is going to have to pick up the slack. And that erodes the morale of certain employees. And typically that work goes to the workforce of the organization. So now those are the same people that are having to pick up the slack for those that are actually not performing to the expectations that were put forward. So it is a very complex issue, and it goes beyond just, taking sick days. It's actually impacts the organization.
Yeah, I love that concept of the slack that has to get taken up because, a lot of our listeners are executives in sports and healthcare, beyond just the military. And when you think about it, we've talked with hospital execs about nurses. One nurse gets hurt, the rest of the nursing team then has to pick up whether it's hours or duties, of one person being out in the same way sports deals with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, for sports teams, it can mean the season. If their star player is out and then you don't have the available bodies to be able to go ahead and pick up that slack. So again, this is something that really affects everyone in the same fashion.
Yeah, and I think the other thing you had mentioned in there, is costs, right? There's certainly a financial cost beyond just the emotional and the morale piece. A lot of times folks may look at the government and say, well, they're a nonprofit, right? So why are they worried about costs? Right. And the cost of training individuals, whether it's a PJ or an airman, right? The cost of training those individuals and bringing those individuals back to duty is fairly significant.
It is. And the Department of Defense invests a lot on the training and the continuing training of special operators for that reason, because we are really Swiss Army knives for whatever the nation needs us to do. And when you lose one, it comes at a high cost, ops tempo, operational tempo, meaning more time for other people to be deployed. And also, can you repair the person to be able to bring him back and it not become a sunk cost for the Department of Defense? I mean, when you really look at SEALs, Special Forces, Marine Forces, and Special Operations, and so on, they're really the embodiment of the $6 million man. And, you have to do everything that you can to go ahead and preserve that asset and to go ahead and fix it and get it back on the line as soon as possible. And if you lose it, then, it takes time to create the next one to come behind it. Hence, one of the special operations truths, which is the number one, that humans are more important than hardware.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a great principle to always remember. And and so, what are some of the areas that you see, the organization, whether it's the DoD or the Air Force, where are they overcoming some of these health challenges, and or what are some good examples that you feel, steps forward that have been taken to address either the economical or the morale side of health loss?
Well, I would like to begin using the pandemic as an example because the Department of Defense did fairly well. We have people that got sick, but very few died. And those that died were because of pre-existing conditions that the virus actually attacked. But for the most part, the force was healthy. And we were able to maintain the battle rhythm to be able to go ahead and continue to take care of national security, which is phenomenal in every sense, specifically with how this pandemic affected the globe. But I think that there's another part of that, and that is what we call left of the band when we are recruiting people to come in. Now, we all know the data shows that society becomes unhealthier every second of the day. We know that obesity rates are through the roof. We know that youth, right now, the unavailable pool is about over 75%. So 3/4 of our young men and women are not allowed to serve in the armed forces because some illness is something else. So what we're doing in order to go ahead and be able to capitalize on that 20-something percent that is able to serve is to make sure that we instill the right habits on them, to make sure that if they're couch potatoes when they come in the door, that we can break them out of those habits and eventually make them into warriors. Because at the end of the day, the enemy doesn't care about many things other than the foe in front of them. And our method has always been for them to fear us because we have the credibility and the combat capability to be able to get after them. So that is something that the Department of Defense does well via their basic training programs and also through the training pipelines that we have. And the majority of that training is focused on warfighting. And we need to continue to do that.
And I love you keep using the H word, habits, right? That keeps getting sprinkled into a lot of the discussions you mentioned, right? Because ultimately you're trying to create or cultivate the right habits and also extinguish some of those that, aren't serving the warfighter.
Yeah, and habits are very important because eventually that's going to become your muscle memory for action. And I was doing an interview here recently, and the interview person actually asked, so why do you stay in shape? Now, I am not in the best shape of my life because my body has broken down in many ways, but I still have the self-respect to be able to be the visible example of the standard that I expect the young troops to have. And that is just one aspect of it. The second aspect is performance. If I'm going to ask them to do something, I better be able to do exactly what I'm asking them to do. And then you do both of those things with the right habits. Eventually, you go ahead and skyrocket the credibility of the leadership that is supposed to guide people towards that common goal, whatever it may be for that organization.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times with leaders, it's that balance between, hey, I may not be as fit as who I'm leading or how fit I used to be, but I'm going to be as fit as I can be for the current stage in my life. And in your case, right, the injuries that may have accumulated, right? Because you can't lose sight that credibility, how important that is from a leadership perspective.
Yeah. And, I tend to discard excuses because I cannot live the way that I used to live, because I cannot run the way that I used to run. I find alternatives for that. And the most important alternative that I always rely on is diet, because diet is really something that can keep you healthy. And exercise, you go ahead and do it as you see fit to make sure that you're not exacerbating the injuries that you currently have. But where there's a will, there's a way. And we need to have people to have a will to be better, to be healthier, to be more productive.
And so where do you see kind of the future for whether that's DoD, Air Force, as you start instilling some of these habits, almost in this pre-basic training, type environment? Where's the future you see of where the force is going from a health perspective?
Well, the future is almost a spin-off of the past. And I recall in the 1960s, right when President Kennedy got elected, he wrote an article for Sports Illustrated that was called The Soft American. And this is just a recollection of what happened in the beginning of the Korean War, to where we didn't have people coming out of the Great Depression that were healthy enough to be able to answer the nation's call, which was very concerning. So then he ended up following a study that NYU, New York University, did, comparing European children versus American children. And the comfortable habits of American society were actually hindering the development of our youth in comparison with the Europeans, to where they were far more active and they were leading healthier lifestyles. So President Kennedy then said, the future of national security is going to be dependent on the actions that take place in the schoolyards of today. We needed to have a national program to go ahead and instill the right habits for youth to be active, for them to eat healthy, for them to go ahead and carry a life that will be conducive to some of these professions. And it's not just national defense. We're talking first responders. When you look at your own profession, when you look at the medical professionals, that is a very stressful life. And if you don't have the right body composition and the right immune system to withstand that stress, you're eventually going to break down quicker than somebody else. So all of those things play into the fact that, the Department of Defense is doing everything they can in their power to capitalize from that youth. But we're going to need help from the education system in the front end to be able to make sure that we instill those habits in our youth, because that is a big shortfall for our nation.
Yeah, it's more of a macro left of the bang, right? Something bigger of the DoD's doing the best they can, but how does a nation do we move left? Because to your point, some of the obesity challenges, these actually aren't new. They've been going on for decades. If President Kennedy is writing, years ago in the Korean War about that, that problem still exists today. And how do we keep addressing people at a younger age?
Yeah, and we can never forget that national security. I'm speaking quite a bit about national security because that's my responsibility at this moment. But staring at a screen is not going to be doing much against an enemy. It may have a part of it on the technological side, but eventually the troops are going to have to move forward to some austere environment, and they're going to have to withstand those field conditions. Health is required, regardless of what duty you have in the Department of Defense, whether it's behind a gun or behind a computer. We're going to need you to go ahead and do exactly what you need to do. And then the actions of the enemy actually get a vote into the way that we need to go ahead and survive. Because you don't know if they're going to have a man-made virus that they're going to go ahead and try to spread. You don't know if they're going to use some kind of agent to incapacitate us. But the healthier you are, the better chance you're going to have to go ahead and withstand whatever they throw at you.
Yeah, that resilience. Well, I know that you've got a very tight packed schedule, and I appreciate the time. And I usually at the end like to kind of summarize, at least if not only for myself, some of the take home points for other leaders listening. And I think a big take home point for me, one of the three, is your point of the impact of an individual on others. One person goes down, it does impact the team, emotionally as well as physically, in the slack that they have to pick up. I think the second point, I'm taking away is you really stressing the importance of habits, particularly, with that concept, that military concept of being left of the bang, right? Because those habits have to start early to be reinforced or to be extinguished. And I think the last piece I get is I love your answer. A lot of times I ask people about the future and they come up with these grand ideas that are, ways off, and you simplify by saying, hey, the future is a spinoff of the past, and more, how do we actually do better, based on what we're currently doing? How do we iterate those in a more linear fashion, and continue to make steps forward, even incrementally, in terms of health habits?
Yeah, absolutely. And then the other two things that I will add to it is, again, that self-respect aspect. You have to be a visible example of what you want your family to be, what you want your employees to, especially if you are in a leadership position. And finally, having the self-discipline to be able to go ahead and carry on with a life that eventually is going to give you more energy, more stamina, more time on planet to be able to enjoy life with the people that you love. So there's a lot of benefits to it, and I'm surprised that more Americans don't pay attention to it.
Yeah, and you keep using the word self there, right? Because ultimately it starts with accountability, right? And how does exactly. How does and for those, this is an audio, SEAC Lopez is pointing to himself, right? It's the self, responsibility, that accountability that we as organizations, as leaders, need to foster within individuals.
Well, and something I have to say about that accountability is that we live in a world right now to where people think that accountability is hostility. If I tell you that you have to fix something because you're violating some law, some rule, some standard, then you're automatically discriminating against somebody. Body shame, you name it. Society's got to get off that kick, and they have to realize that if somebody is having the courage to tell them to fix something they're doing wrong, they should appreciate it and not discard it, not cancel. So we need to be better. And that is part of that self-responsibility as well.
Yeah, I love that. I was talking to my daughter the other day. She said, the coach is always, yelling at me and telling me to fix this. I said, you should be worried when they don't. When they're not telling you to fix something, then they don't care.
Yeah. And a lot of us care. And, I get this a lot from the military. It's like, well, I can't believe that, you said that I was fat or obese. It's like, well, number one, you are. Number two, you need to fix it because you're violating standards. And if you choose not to fix it, then I have to take further action. And that is not discrimination or singling you out. It is simply holding you to the standard that we expect from every single member in this Department of Defense.
Well said. Thank you for your time.
Well, I appreciate it, and thank you. It's been a pleasure.